Well, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Lori Kiddo Lopez, who is a professor of communication arts and the director of the Asian American Studies program at UW-Madison. At UW-Madison, she is also the chair of the Campus Diversity and Climate Committee and the chair of the College of Letters and Sciences DEI committee as well. So she's very involved in diversity issues across campus. She has published widely on Asian American studies media, including Asian American media activism, fighting for cultural citizenship, and most recently, the subject of her talk today, micromedia industries, Hmong American media innovation in the Diaspora. So her most recent book is, so this is sort of a book talk that she's doing today, and it should be really exciting. I've already read about half of the book. And it's really exciting, so I didn't want to read it all because then I would miss the main point at the end, right? So, no, I'm just joking. Anyway, let's give a wide applause for
Thanks, Ian. So thank you all for coming today. I'm very excited to talk about my book. And also I hope you enjoy this beautiful cover by Christina Vang. So this is a research project that I started a very long time ago, back maybe like 2014 or so. I moved here in 2012, immediately started thinking about research projects to do here in Madison. Since I study Asian American media, I thought it made sense to look at Asian American media here. What is the kind of Asian American media that is specific to Wisconsin and the Midwest? And I know we have this strong Hmong studies community here, so I thought it made sense to study Hmong media. So I started out and I just wanted to have conversations with Hmong Americans about what kind of media they're using, what kind of media they're paying attention to. I learned about all sorts of interesting stuff that was going on. And one of the things that struck me the most was that among the extremely wide variety of Hmong media outlets that I discovered, I noticed that they're all very small. And they all have to deal with their small size and scale in some way. So this makes sense for Hmong media. They're a small ethnic group. But from a media studies perspective, this is really interesting because there's a lot of different kinds of media outlets that are also going to be small and that are going to face certain challenges around scaling up. And because of that, the uniqueness of that situation, I thought that that would be a really important thing to focus on. So this idea of Hmong media as what I call micromedia, which I'll explain, is the focus for today's talk. So here are the questions that I'll be answering today. What is distinctive about Hmong media industries? So basically just what did I learn about all of the different kinds of Hmong media and how they stand out, how they're different from other media industries. Specifically, how have Hmong media industries been shaped by their size? And then what lessons can we learn from Hmong media about other small-scale media outlets and industries? And I'll spoil the end of the book. My main conclusion from all of this is that Hmong media are a really important site for theorizing small-scale media production of all kinds. And I think we should not see small size as a limitation or a problem that needs to be fixed, because not all media need to grow. And this is actually something that we do hear a lot, kind of like pressed down on us, that you have to get more followers or bigger audiences, or that growth is the only thing that it will take to survive. And I think that Hmong media show us that that is not true. In fact, all kinds of micromedia are really interesting and important on their own terms, whether or not they ever grow. And I actually see this as a really important way of understanding all forms of Asian American cultural production. But if you just look at a small community and the kinds of media that they're producing, it is important to them on their own terms, and we should consider it that way. Okay, so I'll jump in with my term micromedia. How do I define micromedia? So micromedia are small-scale versions of media production and distribution. Their growth is limited by barriers, so this can include small size of staff, the availability of funding, or the small size of their audience. And because of a combination of those factors, this makes it impossible for these media outlets to scale up and to take advantage of the economies of scale that more traditional media outlets have always relied on. But I would say the most important attribute to me was that when you look behind the camera or behind the scenes, it was just one or two people running an entire media outlet. So I'm basically talking about mom and pop type media outlets. If you look behind the scenes, it's not a paid staff. They don't have that hierarchy of labor. It's just somebody working alone, or maybe one person working alone and having a couple of volunteers helping out with them. Okay, so that's what micromedia are. To understand this concept better, I kind of wanted to triangulate it amongst some related concepts to show why it's so distinctive. So the term micromedia, as I'm defining it, is connected to other concepts that already exist, like niche media, ethnic media, community media. And there is some overlap between what I'm calling micromedia industries and these other terms. But I still think this concept is distinctive enough to deserve more close attention. So I'll explain what I mean by going through each of them. So first, niche media. Niche media target a very specific audience. So they're not aiming for what we call a general audience or a mass audience. I think some examples of this are like manga and anime. So they're considered niche. I have this headline that says, Japanese media is more popular than ever, so why are manga and anime still niche? Also, a show like Schmigadoon, I don't even know if you guys have heard of it, but this show, Schmigadoon, has also been praised. I found this article, it calls it delightfully niche. It's like, oh, see, we definitely call it that. But of course, the reality is that both of these kinds of products, or I guess that's like 3 different products, are all actually enormous industries. And these products have dozens of people working behind the scenes to create them, and they make millions of dollars. So they're usually kind of made in a traditional way. They're produced like traditional media. So I would say they're not micro at all. Another closely related term is ethnic media. So this is a term that can be used to describe all Hmong American media in the diaspora. Ethnic media are culturally specific. They center an ethnic audience that usually gets left out of mainstream media. A lot of Hmong media is in Hmong language, which is another kind of defining characteristic of ethnic media. But not all ethnic media are small, necessarily. So for instance, there are Chinese American newspapers and news platforms and like Spanish language TV channels, things like this that reach millions of subscribers. And they basically operate just like mainstream media. So I have China Daily and Univision. They're ethnic media, but they are in no way micromedia. And of course, not all micromedia are ethnic media. There can be plenty of small-scale media ventures that don't focus specifically on an ethnic minority, so we still need a distinct term that refers to size alone. All right, it's hard to not see my own slides. Can you move this closer? Okay. The term community media is the last one. I think this is a little bit closer. It does imply something distinctive going on behind the scenes. So I'm sure you've heard of like community radio or community television. They are also limited in their ability to financially profit. They're often made by volunteers. And this term is usually used to describe outlets like these. They have kind of a civic-minded goal associated with them. So they're usually invested in something like democratizing media production or helping to educate everyday citizens about how to make media. Sometimes they even have a radical, alternative, political perspective. So I put some of the images that kind of evoke this airwaves or public property statement. In this ad, this one, they're actually asking for volunteers and they're saying, we'll train you up, like anyone can make media, just join us. But they're often kind of emphasizing political goals. So that's not the same as micromedia, right? Also, community media are traditionally associated with a local geographic community. So like community radio, community TV stations are focused on the city or even the neighborhood that they're in. It would be weird to call an international program or like a globally available program community media. So hopefully you can see why I thought it was important to focus specifically on size and scale, and think about what changes when you have an entire media outlet run by just 1 or 2 people when it would be hard to imagine expansion in any way. Okay, so let's get into what I studied. I studied Hmong American media industries, And my goal was to create a really thick, rich portrait of the Hmong media landscape, learn what Hmong media mean to Hmong Americans. So I conducted interviews with over 100 media producers and consumers, some in English and some with an interpreter. For some interviews, I actually went into Hmong homes and had them like kind of walk me through their own media technology landscape. We'd be like, how do you watch TV, or which computer do you use, or show me how you use your phone or your iPad, things like that. So I could understand better how Hmong people are using media in their everyday lives. I also traveled around Wisconsin and Minnesota and California, visiting sites where media production was taking place. So I looked at some TV stations, radio stations, I just talked to like media makers wherever I could find them. And I did a lot of textual analysis. So I would collect as much English language Hmong media as I could find, and I would watch or listen to that. And then for Hmong language media, I worked with a team, a pretty big team of Hmong undergrads. So they would listen to or watch, the TV show or the radio station, and then we would get together. We got kind of like a weekly meetup where I would just be like, "What did you watch this week? Tell me about it." Sometimes I would read a transcription of it, and then we could really dig into the details of it. But we could also be like, "What did it mean to you?" It's almost like a focus group, so I could get a sense for what the Hmong texts were talking about. Okay, so let me show you what I learned about Hmong micromedia industries. So the rest of this talk, I'm going to introduce you to some of the micromedia entrepreneurs that I met over the course of my research. And through my stories about them, I'll be able to illustrate some of my broader findings about Hmong media. So I'll look at what kinds of struggles Hmong media outlets face in terms of labor, how they've overcome those struggles through innovation and entrepreneurship, how they create power and authority through these very small outlets, and what consequences this kind of power has for their communities, how micromedia can both silence and give voice to marginalized communities, and what factors help those voices to survive amidst struggle and criticism. And finally, how micromedia outlets often necessitate creating new media platforms. I call them hybrid media platforms. I'll get into that a little bit more, and how those, I think, expand some of our understandings of certain mediums. All right, so let's meet some media owners. I really wanted to ask for each person to be like, who's heard of this person? Who knows this person? But I guess you can just let me know at the end if there's somebody that you have like an actual connection to and are familiar with their work already. Okay, so this is Steve Tao. He is a man, he lives in St. Paul. He runs the Center for Hmong Arts and Talent. So CHAT is running that as his main job today. And he founded one of the earliest Hmong newspapers. So this is the Hmong Tribune. He founded it in 1998, and it continued until 2016. So I'm sure you're familiar with other Hmong newspapers. There's been quite a few English language Hmong newspapers over the years. And they're a lot like other small ethnic newspapers. Steve told me that he had the goal of putting positive stories out into the community. He wasn't seeing a lot of stories about Hmong communities in mainstream media. And then when he did see stories, there was a lot that were negative, right? This is a very common problem. Like, we only see the problems, so we should tell our own story. So this was a side project that he kept up while doing a full-time job. He had a very small staff of volunteers, and Steve himself served in a bunch of different roles. So when I looked at the masthead for these different issues of the newspaper, they're all in the archives here at the university, you could see that Steve was the publisher editor, the managing editor, the staff writer, the photographer. So what does this tell us about micromedia? Well, this kind of multi-skilling is definitely one of the distinctive markers of micromedia. If there are not that many people working behind the scenes, then each individual person has to develop a really wide skill set. They have to develop many different forms of professional expertise and play many different roles at once. So I was thinking about how this works on like a student film project, maybe just because I'm in communication arts, and so we teach a lot of students how to make movies. And when you have a student film project, usually there's one person, and they might be like writing the film, but also shooting the film and editing the film, and then like writing the music for it. They do a whole bunch of different roles. And this is a distinctive characteristic of micromedia. But something else that I thought was fascinating as I came to learn Steve's story was that he had done so much more than just start this newspaper. he had also been involved in tons of other media projects, some of them at the same time. So I already told you about the Hmong Tribune newspaper, but also his dad, Su Tao, was a Hmong filmmaker. So Steve had worked in his video production business called ST Universal Video. See, people have heard of this. Very famous, obviously. And then in the 1990s, he decided to get into radio. I think the family did. So they bought 3 hours a week for a program called ST Radio, and then that eventually expanded into buying an entire sub-channel. Then in 1997, he partnered with his niece, Song Beng, and they created a web platform called Hmong Online, where users could create profiles and they could post on message boards. I thought this was so fascinating that in 1997, there was this like Hmong Facebook, essentially. This combination of different media activities is effective in a lot of ways. One is that it allows for synergy between these different products. So for instance, the Hmong web platform and the newspaper could host advertisements for the radio show and the movies. So it's like you're in one platform, but you're learning about all these other kinds of Hmong media, all run by the same family. And then instead of having paid subscribers to the newspaper, they would just put them into the boxes that held the DVD deliveries to Hmong grocery stores. So they already had these distribution routes of getting the DVDs into grocery stores, and they were just like, and you get newspapers, you can just put them out on the racks, and then everyone would have access to them all across the country. So these are different ways that he was keeping each individual outlet alive on an extremely limited budget. We can think about how normally newspapers and radio stations are funded. They're usually funded through advertising. This is very challenging for Hmong communities because if you have a small market, then there's not a lot of corporations that are willing to buy ad time to try to reach Hmong audiences. So it's almost impossible for Hmong media outlets to use advertising as their main source of revenue. So another important aspect of micromedia industries is that the individuals who are running them are truly media entrepreneurs. At first glance, it might seem like this is just a guy who has a side project of writing for a free newspaper. But if you scratch beneath the surface, you uncover that there are these incredibly hardworking media professionals. They have mastered all sorts of different roles and skills, and they have created these micromedia empires. And because of that, it's important to recognize them as entrepreneurs and not just dismiss them as hobbyists or gig workers. Okay, let me go on to Dua Chiali. So this is another Hmong media mogul. He's also in the St. Paul area. I visited him in his offices in the Hmong Village shopping center there. So he is kind of similar to Steve in that he has a bunch of different programs. He has like a video news show. It's called Hmong TV 24 Hours. He has a radio program called Radio Hmong. He has a business directory. And I want to focus specifically on his video news show. I think it's a really interesting example of micromedia because it is one of the more surprising kinds of media to learn is still just one guy with his camera. And that's because it's modeled so closely after traditional broadcast news stations. So there are actually a lot of these kinds of Hmong news shows. They look like this, and they all live only on YouTube. So they're just really jumping into our streaming world. They're saying we don't need a full-on broadcast TV station, but they're picking up on all the conventions of traditional news outlets. When you watch them, they have the look and feel of a traditional news show. There's clearly a desire to tap into the legitimacy and authority that come from legacy news stations. So even if it's just one guy and his camera, or sometimes one guy and his daughter running the camera, they dress in suits. They have the chyrons on the bottom of the screen explaining the topics. They bring in people for interviews. They go out in the field. They capture live events. There's another similar program called 3 Hmong TV. I don't know, well, that's not how you say it. But anyway, it's one of the few that actually has volunteer anchors. So there's the guy that's, he's actually not the one running the show, but usually it's just the person who owns the station is also the person on camera. And another thing that gets modeled after legacy television is his YouTube videos. On his YouTube videos is that he takes commercial breaks. But instead of selling ads like a traditional TV station, because I told you that's really hard to do, he just sells his own products, which I guess are probably like MLM products, like face creams, health products. Sometimes he has whole segments featuring interviews that are just about his products, so it kind of becomes more like a QVC shopping channel type situation. But this is a really creative way for a micromedia entrepreneur to fund their outlet. And we actually see this in a lot of conservative media, like Alex Jones sells a lot of products, dietary supplements and creams and things like this. So one of the things I would say about micromedia is that they build from the authority and legitimacy of mainstream TV. This includes copying the styles and the look of TV news, the genre norms, the flow of the show, like moving from segment to segment to a commercial and back, and other qualities. And in some ways, I think this points to how easy it would be to delegitimize micromedia, that there's this threat that's always looming, so that's really hard. They always have to avoid getting delegitimized. But of course, these kinds of channels are very different from legacy television. So they're only on YouTube, which means that audiences are encountering it really differently from TV news. They have to search for it on the YouTube platform, so they have to use that YouTube algorithm to actually get their show in front of audiences. It's also really disassociated from any physical location, so no one really has to know where it was filmed or who it's filmed for, unlike local news programs, which are only available in their local neighborhoods. And when I saw Hmong people in their homes and they were watching these kinds of programs on their iPads, they would just kind of click around. Like they would just type Hmong. They would literally just type Hmong into YouTube. If you type Hmong in there, you'll probably come up with these news shows too. And then they would just play it and the algorithm would kind of pop up to a different show. They would just kind of go all over the place. They didn't really know who this guy was, where he was from. They definitely did not know that this show was never broadcast on television. It doesn't really matter. This is just what Hmong TV is. So we can see here that some of the conventions of TV are being sustained and some are being challenged. And I think that the way that they model themselves after TV and have developed this authority and legitimacy comes to matter a lot when they deal with controversial issues. So Dua Chiali and his show are actually pretty controversial. One time he called himself the Hmong Jerry Springer because of how he likes to rile people up. Lately he's been talking about how Biden stole the election, so this is like right in his lane. But he really came under attack from the Hmong community a couple of years ago when he posted a video that was really critical of Hmong women, specifically Hmong divorced women. Maybe some of you remember this incident. He said Hmong divorced women are worthless, and that's why it's okay for Hmong men to marry young women in Laos. And he got a lot of backlash. So all of a sudden he became very popular for people criticizing him. So there were a lot of very vocal Hmong women who organized to fight against this misogyny. They responded right away with comments in the YouTube video. There were a lot of Facebook posts. There was a change.org petition. This issue filled up my social media feeds for a while. It was very interesting to observe. But the way that it unfolded also communicated some interesting things about Hmong TV stations like this one as micromedia. So I would say that first, it was clear from the way that people attacked the show that they didn't really understand that it was micromedia. So they were saying things like, this man should be fired. Hmong TV should have higher standards for its staff. They even called for its broadcast license to be suspended. And all of these comments make sense for a legacy TV station that would have like a hierarchy of a staff where somebody is managing and making decisions about on-air talent. And I study media activism a lot, and these are really common things to say about a problematic show. But of course, none of them make sense within the context of micromedia. There's no staff, there's no broadcast license, and he cannot be fired. So one thing that we learn about all of these markers of mainstream media is that they've been really effective in creating a kind of media power that is accepted by the audience. So all of those markers of mainstream media that are being taken up by Mr. Chiali have given him the kind of status and authority that audiences assume of a television show. But this debate also points to the resilience of micromedia outlets. So if an outlet is just created by one person and they're running the whole thing by themselves, there's really not that much that can be done to get them to stop. The audiences might shrink a bit, which could be disappointing, but these outlets are defined by their small size of their audience already. So in this case, it might be kind of unfortunate that audiences couldn't do anything. Like they really couldn't get him to respond in a meaningful way. They certainly did not kick him off of YouTube. But we can also think of many cases where this kind of resilience is admirable and powerful. Oh, sorry, I didn't click through it. Hmong media resilient against attacks. This is my next example. Okay, so let's talk about Hmong. So this is the case of queer voices on Hmong radio. So this is Chu Feng Xiong, Cam Yang, and Sonic Rain, and they were part of a radio program called Hmong. This is an hour-long show. It was on the air every other week from 2016 to 2019. It was broadcast on 1590 AM out of St. Paul. This is one of the only 3, I think-ish, Hmong-owned radio stations in the country. And Cam's mom, Mai Yang, is the owner of the radio station. I think that's really cool because it's also the only radio station I've heard of that's owned by a Hmong woman. So the radio station itself is micromedia. The only staff are Mai Yang and her son, and then they have a part-time engineer serving as paid staff. They run the whole radio show. All of the shows are run by volunteers, and as you can see from my story, she enlisted her other child, Cam, to do one of the shows. So Cam then recruited their friends, Sonic Rain and Chu Feng, to do the show, and the 3 of them decided it would be focused on Hmong American youth and LGBTQIA+ issues. So Cam and Sonic identify as queer and trans, and Chu Feng identifies as a straight cisgender Hmong man. So they thought that was really cool that they could have him kind of model allyship and give a point of identification for straight cisgender listeners, but that the main topics of the show would be about queer and genderqueer issues. So I think this show points to some of the freedoms and possibilities of micromedia. They can have a radio show that's focused on this very, very specific identity, but it's an important identity. There is so little LGBTQIA+ focused Hmong media out there. And they in some ways, they stuck to the traditional conventions of radio. So they would play some music, they would have folks on to interview them. It's really important to see queer folks doing this kind of professional media making and fitting into professional norms. But I also thought it was cool when they would experiment and push outside of those boundaries. So one time I saw this program. So this is actually not the same show, it's another show, but Sonic Rain, the host, was a guest on this show. So this is an hour-long community program that focused specifically on gender issues. So it's called Polai, Bad Hmong Girl. And one of the shows, or actually a couple of the shows that they did, brought in Hmong playwrights, and then they would perform little radio dramas over the course of the show. So one of the ones that I was listening to is a story about a Hmong woman in a bad marriage who gets shamed and told that she's a bad Hmong girl, a bad Hmong woman, but it's her husband who is the bad person. It's just calling attention to troubling gender issues. So I thought this was cool. I got maybe just as a media studies scholar, but radio dramas are something that used to be really important in the early days of radio, and now you never see them. Like you would never turn on your car radio, listening to a clear channel radio station and hear a radio drama being performed. So it's actually like pretty innovative and experimental, and it's being used to call attention to these kinds of gender issues. So I think that's one of the innovations. And then another way that I thought they got to be really creative was through their use of digital technology. So they would always broadcast their program on Facebook Live.
Hi. Welcome to Blown Radio. Everyone said hello. And Sonic's doing some weird thing. I don't know what it is.
Dance moves.
It's the boy.
Welcome everybody, good evening. We are happy to be back. This is the Blown Radio Show, Balloon Baby with Sonic Rain.
I'm Cam.
And I'm Chu Feng.
It's all good, it's all good.
Okay, that's just like what it would look like. They're clearly being silly and goofing around, and then the show would go live because the song ended, and then you could see them actually turning into radio performers right before your eyes. So I think this serves a lot of functions for this micromedia enterprise. One is that they're able to change an all audio format of radio into something that has video, which is really cool because you can see what they look like. They can add performance like dancing or like jokes. Their humor style works a lot more. They're infusing a lot of joy into their broadcast. I think that's very political, especially because they're queer. So seeing Hmong queer folks like having fun and loving each other is really important. But it also allowed them to form an archive of their show. So radio is a really ephemeral medium, and there's very little record of Hmong radio in general because it just goes off into the ether. But since Hmong they would stream their show on Facebook Live, that automatically created a video recording of it. And that's a more resilient place for audiences to be able to engage with them. So people could miss the show. Usually I think they imagined people listening to them in their car radios. But if you happen to not be driving and miss the 2 hours a week that they were on, you could just watch it online later and get the whole show. Also, it's free to post on Facebook, which is a great invention. So I was sad to see that actually when they stopped running the show, they took down their Facebook page. So I was like, oh, now there's no more archive. I don't really know why they did that, but they're retaining control over their own voice. So if they want to delete their archive, that's up to them. But one of the things about this radio show is that I would say it blurred the boundaries of what counts as radio because it's moving between an audio medium and this digital video medium. And that happens a lot with micromedia. That even if media entrepreneurs want to benefit from the legitimacy and professionalism of legacy media, they are often pushing the boundaries of media. So let's look at my other example. I was like, is she gonna come today? No. Okay, so this is Chua Lee, who I hope you all know. She was my instructor for Siasi and teaches Hmong language here. She is also a radio DJ, but unlike Cam and Sonic Rain and Chu Feng, she doesn't have a radio show on an AM/FM radio show. She has a radio show on Hmong Teleconference Radio. Maybe some of you have heard of this. So basically what Hmong communities have been doing is they're using free conference call software to create radio. So someone sets up the call on their computer. It's usually the kind of program that businesses use when they're just trying to get people to call into meetings. It's not like Zoom is happening these days. This predates Zoom. It's just sound. So then they share the number. It's like it's just a phone number for people to call in on their cell phones. The calls can actually hold up to 1,000 or 2,000 people at once. So they're very large conference calls. And then if you run them constantly 24/7, it becomes a form of radio. So the person who owns the channel divides up the hours of the day and assigns them to a team of volunteer DJs. They each focus on a specific subject. So then they kind of create a station or a schedule that's very similar to traditional radio. So there are times of the day when you would tune in and you'd be able to hear music or news discussions, discussions about health and medicine, discussions about religion. There are a lot of call-in shows where people give advice about things like relationships and families and cultural customs. And it was really important to Hmong people. So a lot of people I talked to could not even chose not to distinguish between traditional radio and this kind of cell phone radio. This form of media is obviously made possible by the specific way that we use cell phones nowadays. So this is a community that has some financial limitations and some technological limitations. So maybe they don't have a smartphone that can get online or the technological literacy to figure out how to stream some kind of radio show on their cell phone. They're also definitely spread all over the country and all over the world in small pockets, and sometimes they just have a phone that makes phone calls. That is the main use of their cell phone, is just to make phone calls, but they have a wireless plan with unlimited minutes. So then they can call into these shows. And this is a great example of how micromedia can be technologically innovative. Yeah, because their main goal is to just specifically meet their audience where they are at. I think it was even interesting to try to name this kind of format. I call it teleconference radio, but I also would use terms like cell phone radio or just radio to name it. So that points to what this difficulty of figuring out what kind of genre or what kind of medium it is. I call these formations hybrid media platforms. So they're taking multiple mediums and blending them together and creating something new that's kind of hard to define and describe. Obviously, Hmong media are not the only ones doing this kind of work, expanding beyond certain platforms. It is one of the defining characteristics of our digital age that the borders between different mediums get blurry. But I do think that micromedia entrepreneurs should be recognized as pioneers in this space. So we're just seeing so much creativity and experimentation because people like Chua are obviously not okay with a world where Hmong people sitting in their homes all alone have to remain isolated and disconnected. They are finding a way to reach out and connect to each other. So there are a lot of really cool things going on with these teleconference radio programs. One of the things is that they provide a really important space for marginalized community members to participate in creating media. And in particular, one of the surprising aspects of these shows is that women are the primary owners, hosts, and participants. So this is a picture that I had found on a website. There's not that many websites about these programs, but because there was this one, I was like, aha, I can see all the women who are involved in this. So I'm not saying that men do not participate in these shows. They definitely are both on the calls, but it is heavily skewed toward women, and women are often taking up the leadership roles of creating this platform for women's voices. So just like Chua Lee, she has a show about, or the last time I talked to her, she told me she had a show about relationship issues and love stories, and then another one about healthcare and nutrition, and she would get 1,000 listeners every time she was on the air. So it's also important to talk about participation here. All forms of micromedia are fairly participatory because there are low barriers to entry if it's just one person deciding to get involved in media production. But this is a deeply participatory form of media. It invites people in, it's bottom up, it's non-hierarchical. It's a participatory form of media that challenges our understanding of radio, which is usually all about gatekeepers, like trying to get your song onto a radio station is really hard. And Chua was very clear about the benefits of these programs for women because she said that she would talk to other listeners and they say that they're facing a lot of issues in their lives and that their mental health really improves when they get to hear that they're not alone in facing some really challenging issues. So it's been a real lifeline for Hmong women during dark times. She's also heard stories about how Hmong women decide to stand up for themselves more after participating on the conference calls, which can sometimes give the shows a bad reputation among the husbands who see a change in their wives. So this kind of brings me to the less celebratory side of these shows, which is that they often have somewhat of a negative reputation among Hmong Americans. So when I talked to Hmong audiences about these shows, and often the people who would say that they didn't listen to them, they were very critical. So people would say that they were embarrassed. They thought that these shows were just full of fighting and drama and conflict. They were really worried about their moms and aunties who seemed addicted to the shows. They said that maybe people only listen to them if they don't have a meaningful way to spend their time. They also worried about misinformation being spread. They thought that they were actually dangerous because they were so unregulated. People would tell stories about their relatives listening to the show and then learning something really awful, like they shouldn't trust banks, or about some kind of new medicine that they should use instead of going to the doctor. So some of these criticisms fit into larger fears about media and misinformation that we see all over the place today. But some of these criticisms seem really gendered. So if we think about how these shows are primarily run by women, and we think about how women's media have always been criticized as less valuable, less trustworthy, too emotional, not professional or intellectual, then we can think about these criticisms aligning with gender norms. These comments also mirror fears about a lot of digital technologies, especially those concerns about addiction and the skepticism that the wisdom of the crowds could ever be as legitimate as actual professionals and experts. But as I mentioned before, micromedia are resilient. So as long as people want to keep running these shows, there's really nothing anyone can do to stop them. Okay, so I'm going to start wrapping things up. Here's my complete list of things that I've talked about today. I've talked about how Hmong micromedia require multi-skilling on the part of the owner, how owners should be recognized as entrepreneurs, how they benefit from the authority and legitimacy of mainstream media, how they're resilient against attacks, but also vulnerable to the whims of their owners, how they have low barriers to entry, which is what makes them important vehicles for highlighting marginalized voices in many cases, and how they build from existing digital platforms, but are also technologically innovative. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, Hmong people are doing really interesting and important things with micromedia, but they aren't the only ones. Micromedia are all around us. So I thought I would also conclude by gesturing to some of the other kinds of outlets and platforms that I think also deserve closer examination as micromedia because of how their size and scale has shaped them. This is just a partial list, but rural newspapers, I think there's a whole world of hyperlocal journalism, like all the newspapers serving small towns in Wisconsin are micromedia. The documentary films made in the one-man band style, actually a lot of Asian American documentaries that I like to study are made like this. Influencers making social media content on all sorts of niche topics. You know, it's usually just one person running an account unless you're like really lucky. YouTubers and Instagrammers also who are just trying to get their content out into the world. Musicians who are, instead of trying to get signed with a record deal, just put their songs on Spotify and try to grow their own audiences. Bloggers of all kind. I'm specifically interested in food bloggers, so I like this idea of people just getting out there, writing their own recipes and not trying to like sell a cookbook and join the food media industry. Also podcasters, so I would say the vast majority of podcasters are micromedia. There's a few, you know, podcast networks that have pretty big staffs and millions of dollars behind them, but by and large, most podcasters are just by themselves, one person in their microphone. And a lot more. So when we look at these kinds of media as micromedia, I think there are important questions that could be asked in different kinds of orientations that we could take to them. For instance, are we creating professional training programs that speak to the realities of micromedia? Is this how we are framing journalism school or film school or other professional programs? We should be thinking about sustainability because micromedia outlets lead to a lot of burnout. There's the obvious lack of professional support because they don't have any colleagues. And there's also the feeling of pressure because like if they stop for 1 minute, then the whole outlet will crumble. I've also pointed to how these outlets are sometimes treated as if they're not professional or they're not as important as traditional media outlets. So how can we make sure that these outlets are being supported and how can we make sense of their actual contributions? Whose voices are being highlighted and whose are being silenced? And how does the size and scale of these outlets shape their ability to be heard and taken seriously? Above all, I hope to have inspired more respect for the amount of time, energy, and labor that these skilled professionals have put into creating media that meet the specific needs of Hmong American communities and Hmong American communities throughout the diaspora. Thank you.